One street corner, one violin. And one brave melody changed the life of a silent boy and the hearts of everyone who watched. The city was waking up slowly that morning. Cold wind moved through the narrow streets, carrying the smell of roasted coffee and rain. People hurried past each other, wrapped in coats and scarves, eyes fixed on their phones or the pavement ahead. No one seemed to notice the girl standing near the park's entrance with a violin resting under her chin. Her name was Alina. Her fingers were red from the cold, but she played as if the music came straight from her soul. Each note of her violin floated through the air like a whisper, soft and aching. She had been playing on this corner for months, hoping someone would stop and listen. Some did, for a few seconds, then moved on. Most didn't even glance her way. Alina didn't blame them. Everyone had their own worries. She herself had too many to count and paid rent, a broken heater in her tiny apartment, and the dream that felt like it was slipping further away every day. She had once dreamed of joining the city orchestra, performing in grand halls under shining lights. But now she played for coins and small bills dropped into her violin case. Still, when she played, she forgot about hunger and cold. The music made her feel alive. That morning, as she finished a sad melody, she noticed a small figure standing a few feet away. It was a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with light brown hair and eyes full of something she couldn't quite name. He was staring at her like the sound was magic. Behind him stood a tall man in a dark suit. His expression was serious, almost distant. The man looked out of place among the ordinary people hurrying by. His coat was perfectly pressed. His shoes shone like mirrors. He didn't seem like someone who stopped for street performers. But there he was, quietly watching his son. The boy didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her violin, as if he was afraid to blink and miss a note. Alina smiled gently at him and began to play a softer tune, a lullaby she had written years ago for her mother, who had passed away. The melody was simple, warm, full of love and memory. The boy's eyes widened, and then something beautiful happened. His lips curved into the smallest smile. It was faint, but real. Alina saw it and felt a lump rise in her throat. She played even softer, pouring all her heart into the final notes. When the song ended, silence hung in the air for a few seconds. Then, the tall man stepped forward. He didn't say a word, just took out his wallet and dropped a large bill, larger than she had ever seen, in her violin case. Then he placed his hand gently on the boy's shoulder and guided him away. Alina watched them leave, her bow still in her hand. Something about the pair stayed with her, the quiet boy and his father, who looked like he carried the weight of the world. She wondered who they were and why the boy seemed so lost and silent as the day went on. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, the way the boy's eyes had softened, the way the father had looked at him when he smiled. She didn't know their names, but she felt she had somehow touched their lives in that small, fragile moment. That evening, she packed her violin and walked home. Her apartment was tiny and old, with cracked walls and a window that let in more wind than light. She boiled water for tea, counted the money she had made, and found the large bill again. It was too much for a street performance, far too generous. She hesitated, wondering if she should have given it back. But she needed it. Rent was due in 2 days. She sat on her narrow bed, holding her violin across her lap, and thought about the little boy. His eyes had reminded her of herself when she was younger, quiet, afraid to speak after her mother died. Music had been her only way to express what she couldn't say out loud. Maybe it was the same for him. Across the city, in a large mansion surrounded by high walls and silence, the same boy sat by the window. His name was Eli. He held a small wooden toy in his hands and moved it slowly across the table, not making a sound. His father, Richard Caldwell, stood by the door. Watching him, Richard was one of the richest men in the city, a man people respected and feared. But at home, he felt powerless. His son hadn't spoken a single word in 2 years, not since his wife Isabella had died in a car crash. Doctors, therapists, teachers, none of them had helped. Eli lived in silence, trapped in his own world. But today, something had been different. On the way to his doctor's appointment, They had passed a corner where a young woman played the violin, and for the first time in years Eli had stopped. He had listened. He had smiled. Richard couldn't stop thinking about it. That sound, the soft, trembling notes, had reached his son in a way no one else had managed. It had even reached him. For a brief moment, he had seen life flicker back into Eli's eyes. It scared him and gave him hope at the same time. He stood in his study that night, staring at the city lights through tall glass windows. He could buy anything he wanted: cars, planes, houses, but not what mattered most: his son's laughter, his wife's voice, his own peace. He thought about the violinist again, the way she played, the emotion in her face, the gentleness in her eyes. Maybe she could help Eli in ways money couldn't. Maybe music could do what medicine had failed to do. Meanwhile, Alina was trying to sleep, but her mind wouldn't quiet down. She kept imagining the boy's smile, wondering if he would ever hear her play again. Somewhere deep inside, she wished he would. She didn't know that at that very moment, the man in the dark suit was thinking the same thing, that this wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning. Outside, the city had gone quiet. The wind whispered through the empty streets, carrying with it the faint echo of Elena's violin, sound that had, for the first time in years, awakened something in two hearts that had almost forgotten how to feel. The next morning, Richard sat in his office, but he couldn't focus on the numbers on the screen. Meetings, reports, investments, none of it seemed important anymore. His mind kept going back to the sound of that violin and to the small smile on Eli's face. It had been so long since he had seen any expression on his son's face other than sadness. That moment on the street had been short, but it felt like a small miracle. He called his assistant, Grace, into the room. She was a calm woman in her 40s, loyal and efficient. "Grace," he said quietly, "I need you to find someone." She looked surprised. "A person, sir?" He nodded. "A young woman who plays violin near Central Park. She was playing yesterday morning. I want her name, where she lives, everything." Grace didn't ask questions. She was used to her boss's unusual requests, though this one was different. There was something gentle in his voice that she hadn't heard before. By the afternoon, she returned with the information. "Her name is Alina," she said, handing him a folder. "She's 24, recently moved here. She plays on the street most mornings and gives small lessons to children on weekends. She lives in an old apartment building downtown." Richard opened the folder. There was a photo of her from a social media page, smiling, holding her violin. She looked kind and alive in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. He closed the file and said softly, "I want to hire her." Meanwhile, Alina was sitting in her small apartment, surrounded by sheet music and unpaid bills. The landlord had already given her one final warning. If she didn't pay in 2 days, she'd have to leave. She tried to stay calm and focused on her music, but her heart felt heavy. She had gone out that morning to play, but the wind was harsh, and few people had stopped. When she heard a knock at her door that evening, she almost didn't open it. But then she saw a well-dressed woman standing there. "Grace, are you Alina?" she asked politely. "Yes," Alina said carefully. "Is something wrong?" Grace smiled kindly. "No, nothing's wrong. My employer heard you playing the violin recently. He was very moved by your music. He would like to hire you to play privately for his son, twice a week. The pay is very generous." Alina blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Play for his son?" she repeated. "Yes, his son hasn't been well, and your music seemed to help him." Grace handed her a card with the Caldwell family name and address printed on it. "If you're interested, come tomorrow afternoon. You'll be paid for your time, even if it doesn't work out." After Grace left, Alina sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the card. It felt too good to be real. Private work for a wealthy family? Enough pay to clear her debts? It sounded like a dream. But she also felt nervous. What if she wasn't good enough? What if they expected something more professional than a street musician could offer? She didn't sleep much that night. She polished her violin, ironed her only clean blouse, and told herself to be brave. The next afternoon, she arrived at the address on the card. Her breath caught when she saw the house. It wasn't a house at all. but a grand mansion surrounded by tall iron gates and gardens that looked like something out of a movie. She hesitated before pressing the bell. Grace opened the door and smiled. "Come in, Miss Alina." The warmth inside the mansion made her shiver with relief. The floors were marble, the ceilings high, the air filled with the faint scent of flowers. She followed Grace down a long hallway until they stopped at a large room with tall windows and a piano in the corner. "Mr. Caldwell will join you soon," Grace said, then quietly left. Alina stood there, holding her violin tightly, feeling completely out of place. She was staring at her own reflection in the shiny floor when the door opened. Richard Caldwell entered the room. He looked even more intimidating in person, tall, dressed perfectly, but with eyes that seemed tired and sad. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. "My son Eli will be here soon. I'd like you to play something for him. Anything you think might make him feel calm?" Alina nodded nervously. A few minutes later, a young boy entered, led by a caretaker. It was the same boy from the street, the one who had smiled at her music. He looked at her with quiet curiosity, his lips closed as always. Alina smiled gently. "Hello, Eli," she said softly. "Do you remember me?" He didn't speak, but he gave a small nod. That alone made her relax a little. She lifted her violin and began to play a simple, soothing melody. The notes filled the big room like warm sunlight. Eli sat on the rug and watched her. His eyes followed her fingers as they moved gracefully over the strings. Richard stood near the door, watching his son closely. Something in the boy's face changed as the music went on. His shoulders relaxed. His expression softened. When the last note faded, he reached out and touched the violin bow gently, as if to say he wanted more. Alina smiled and began another song, lighter this time for half an hour. The room was filled with nothing but music and quiet breathing. When she finally stopped, Eli looked peaceful, almost sleepy. It was the calmest Richard had seen him in years. "Thank you," Richard said quietly. "You've done more in one afternoon than any doctor has done in months." Alina blushed. "I'm glad he liked it." He offered her the job officially, then 2 sessions every week, at her own schedule, with pay beyond anything she had expected. She accepted, though she could hardly believe it. Before she left, Eli picked up a crayon from the table and began drawing a picture. When he was done, he handed it to her shyly. It was a drawing of a violin and a smiling stick figure. Alina took it with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered. On her way home, the city looked different. The same gray streets now seemed filled with light. She clutched the drawing to her chest, feeling warmth for the first time in months. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about the strange turn her life had taken. One day she was playing for strangers on a cold street, and the next she was being welcomed into a mansion to help a little boy find his voice again. Across the city, Richard sat in his study, staring at the quiet garden outside. For the first time in a long time, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could begin to heal. He whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, she'll play again." And in another room, Eli fell asleep, holding the small wooden toy in one hand and a drawing of a violin in the other. Days turned into weeks, and Alina became a regular part of the Caldwell mansion. Every Tuesday and Friday afternoon she arrived with her violin in its worn brown case and a gentle smile on her face. At first, she had been nervous every time she walked through those tall doors. But soon, the coldness of the big house began to fade. Replaced by the quiet warmth that came whenever she played, Eli would always be waiting for her in the music room. Sitting cross-legged on the soft carpet with his sketchbook beside him, he still didn't speak, but his eyes told her everything. When he liked a song, they would sparkle softly. When he was sad, they would lower to the floor. Alina learned to read him without words. Richard often stood near the door, pretending to be busy with his phone or papers, but really he was listening. He noticed that his son seemed calmer after every session. The nightmares that used to wake him at night happened less often now. Sometimes, he even caught Eli humming softly to himself, broken, uncertain sounds, but sounds nonetheless. Alina started to bring new pieces each time. Some were cheerful, some soft and dreamlike. One day, She played an old folk song from her childhood, and Eli began tapping his fingers on the floor to the rhythm. She smiled and kept playing. "That's it," she whispered softly. "You're feeling the beat." The boy gave a small nod and kept tapping, his face glowing with shy joy. One afternoon, after finishing a song, Richard approached her. "You have a gift," he said quietly. "He listens to you in a way he doesn't listen to anyone else." Lena smiled. "Maybe it's not me," she said softly. "Maybe it's the music. Sometimes music can say what words can't." He looked at her for a moment, as if her words had hit something deep inside him. Then he nodded and walked away, his expression unreadable. Over time, they began to talk more. Richard told her about his late wife Isabella, how she had been a pianist, how she used to fill the house with music every morning. He explained that after her death, the mansion became silent. The piano stayed closed, the instruments untouched. Even Eli's laughter had vanished. "I tried everything," he admitted one evening after Eli had gone to bed. "Doctors, therapists, special schools, but nothing reached him. Then you came along, and somehow—" "He's different." Lena listened quietly. "Maybe he just needed to feel something again," she said. "Music can remind us that it's okay to feel." For the first time since she had met him, Richard smiled faintly. "You sound like Isabella," he said. She used to say the same thing. Elena felt a soft sadness for him. She could see how much he missed his wife, how he carried his grief like a shadow. Even surrounded by wealth, he looked like a man who had lost the most valuable thing of all. That night, when she returned home, she couldn't stop thinking about the father and son. She wanted to do something special for them, something that would help them both heal. So she began to compose a new piece of music, slowly and carefully. Over several nights, it was gentle but full of hope. She named it The Silent Heart. Every note was meant to tell a story of pain, loss, and finding light again. She practiced it until her fingers hurt and tears rolled down her cheeks. It was the most honest thing she had ever written. When she brought it to the mansion that week, she felt nervous. Richard was there, standing behind Eli as usual. She smiled at them both. "I wrote something new," she said. "It's for Eli." She began to play. The first notes were soft, almost like a whisper. Then the music grew, weaving through the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Eli stared at her, eyes wide, his little hands pressed to his chest. The melody rose and fell like breathing, gentle but full of emotion. Richard stood still, his eyes fixed on his son. He saw something he hadn't seen in years, Lee's lips moving, his throat trembling as if he wanted to speak. Elena played with her eyes closed, lost in the sound. Then, just as the final note faded, a small voice broke the silence. It was weak and uncertain, but clear. "Again," Eli whispered. The bow slipped from Elena's hand. For a second, she thought she had imagined it. But when she looked up, Eli was staring right at her, smiling through watery eyes. "Again," he said softly. Richard froze. His breath caught and his heart felt like it had stopped. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes wide in disbelief. "Eli," he whispered. The boy turned to him and nodded. "Again," he said for the third time, pointing at the violin. Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion. Tears filled her eyes as she lifted the violin once more and began to play. Richard sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands as the sound filled the room again. For the first time in years, his son had spoken in. It was because of music. When the song ended, Eli ran to her and hugged her legs tightly. She froze, then knelt down and hugged him back. "You did it," she whispered. "You found your voice." Richard could hardly speak. I don't know how to thank you," he said softly. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." Lena smiled gently. "It wasn't me," she said. "It was him. He just needed to remember that he still had music inside him." That night, the mansion didn't feel quiet anymore. The air seemed lighter, almost alive. Richard sat beside his son, watching him draw pictures of violins, hearts, and smiling faces. When Elena left, she looked back through the tall gates and saw them both standing at the window, waving. For the first time, she saw Richard smile, a real, warm smile that reached his eyes. As she walked home under the city lights, her heart felt full. She knew this was only the beginning. Something had changed forever, not just for Eli, but for all of them. Music had spoken where words had failed, and in that silent house, hope had finally found its voice. The weeks that followed felt like a beautiful dream for everyone in the Caldwell house. Eli had begun to speak small words, slowly, shyly, but words nonetheless. He said thank you again, and sometimes even Papa. Each word was a small miracle. Richard found himself listening for his son's voice every morning, and each time he heard it, he felt something in his chest loosen. Something that had been locked away for years. Alina continued to visit, her music filling the one silent mansion with life again. Every time she arrived, Eli ran to the door to greet her with his shy smile. Sometimes he would pull her by the hand straight to the music room, eager for her to start playing. Richard often joined them now, sitting near the window, pretending to read. Though his eyes always ended up watching them both, Alina felt like part of the family. The staff had grown fond of her. Too, they often left small treats in the kitchen for her to take home. Everyone could feel the change in the house. It wasn't just the music. It was the warmth she brought with her. One evening, Richard asked her to stay after her session. They sat in the large living room, the fire glowing softly in the background. Eli's progress is unbelievable, he said quietly. You've done something no one else could. I want to do something to thank you properly. Lena shook her head quickly. You don't have to thank me, Mr. Caldwell. I'm just happy he's improving. That's enough for me, he smiled faintly. You remind me of Isabella, he said softly. She used to say things like that. She cared more about people than money. His voice trembled slightly, but he looked calm. She would have loved to hear your music. Alina smiled sadly. Then I'll keep playing for her, too, she said gently. As the days passed, Richard decided to host a small private gathering at the mansion. It wasn't a party for business partners or friends. It was for Eli. He wanted to celebrate his son's progress and show how far he'd come. He asked Alina to perform one special piece at the event, The Silent Heart, the song that had awakened Eli's voice. Alina was both honored and nervous. She wanted everything to be perfect. The night before the concert, she stayed up late practicing, her bow moving gently across the strings until her arms ached. When she finally packed her violin and left for home, it was nearly midnight. The next morning, disaster struck. On her way to the mansion, as she walked through the crowded subway station, someone bumped into her hard. Her violin case slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a sharp crack. She froze, heart pounding, as she opened the case and saw the damage. The bridge was broken, and one of the strings had snapped. Her violin, the same one she'd played since she was a teenager, was ruined. Tears filled her eyes. That violin wasn't just an instrument. It was her companion, her hope, her only way to express herself. Without it, she felt lost. She tried to find a repair shop, but the man behind the counter shook his head. I can fix it, but it'll take at least a week, he said. You'll need a replacement for now. She didn't have money for a new violin. Not even close. And the concert was that very evening. Panic filled her chest as she hurried to the Caldwell mansion, clutching her broken violin like a wounded friend. When she arrived, Grace met her at the door. Alina, are you all right? You look pale. My violin, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's broken. I don't know what to do. Grace's eyes widened, and before Elena could say more, Richard appeared. He could see the worry written all over her face. What happened? He asked softly. She explained, showing him the damage. I'm so sorry, Mr. Caldwell. I can't play tonight. I'll understand if you want to cancel the event. Richard didn't say anything for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he gently took the case from her hands. Come with me, he said. He led her down the hallway to a large room she had never entered before. Inside were shelves filled with instruments, violins, pianos, cellos, all shining under the soft light. Isabella used to collect them, he said quietly. She loved their stories. Every instrument here has one. He walked to a glass cabinet and carefully opened it. Inside lay a violin, unlike any she had ever seen, dark wood, polished smooth, strings that gleamed faintly under the light. This one was her favorite, he said. An 18th-century violin, handcrafted in Italy. She played it at charity events, and she always said it sounded like a voice from heaven. He turned to Alina and smiled gently. She would have wanted you to use it. Her eyes widened in shock. I can't. It's too precious. He shook his head. No. What's precious is what you do with it. Play it for my son. It's for her. For yourself. Elena's hands trembled as she took the instrument. It felt light and warm, almost alive. She whispered thank you, her voice breaking. That evening, the mansion filled with quiet guests. Close. Friends of the family and a few neighbors who had watched the Caldwells from afar. Everyone was curious about the mysterious violinist who had helped Eli find his voice again. The lights dimmed, and Alina stepped forward, the ancient violin cradled in her hands. Richard stood behind her with Eli beside him. Holding his small violin like he wanted to join her, she took a deep breath and began to play. The silent heart, the sound that filled the room, was unlike anything anyone had ever heard. The violin's voice was rich, deep, and full of emotion. Every note seemed to tell a story of loss, love, and healing. The guests were silent. Eli's eyes shone with tears. Richard felt his throat tighten as he remembered his wife's laughter, her music, her kindness. He reached down and took Eli's hand, holding it tightly. When the song ended, the room was completely still for a moment, and then soft applause filled the air. Eli looked up at his father and whispered, "Thank you, Papa." Richard couldn't speak. He knelt down, pulled his son into his arms, and held him tightly. The guests wiped their eyes as they watched. Alina stood there quietly, tears on her cheeks, smiling through the music's echo. For the first time in years, the Caldwell mansion was not a place of grief, but of light. After everyone left, Richard approached her again. "You've given me more than music, Alina," he said softly. "You've given me back my son." "And he's given me back my hope," she said. That night, when she left the mansion, she carried the violin carefully in her arms. The sky above was filled with stars, and for the first time in a long time, both Alina and the Caldwell family felt the same thing, a quiet peace, born from the music that had brought them together. A month after the concert, life began to change in ways none of them had expected. The Caldwell mansion, once silent and heavy with sadness, was now filled with laughter and music. Eli talked more each day, his voice still soft, but steady. He started humming tunes Alina played, and sometimes he even tried to copy them on a small violin his father had bought him. Richard couldn't stop watching his son. Every time Eli smiled or spoke, it felt like a gift. There were still moments of quiet and tears when memories of Isabella came back, but now there was also light a sense that life could still be beautiful. Alina continued to visit twice a week, though sometimes she stayed longer just to spend time with Eli, helping him learn simple songs. The boy adored her. Whenever she entered the house, he ran to meet her with open arms. The entire staff loved watching them together. Even Grace, who had worked for Richard for over a decade, said she had never seen the house so alive. One sunny afternoon, Richard asked Alina to join him in his study. She walked in, holding her violin case, and noticed a stack of papers on his desk. "You've done something remarkable," he said, looking at her with warmth in his eyes. "You gave my son back his happiness. I can never repay that, but I want to try." He handed her a folder. Inside was an application form for the National Orchestra, something she had dreamed about for years but never thought possible. "You're one of the most talented musicians I've ever heard," Richard said. "You belong on that stage." Alina looked up, surprised. I can't afford the fees." "The auditions are expensive. And the travel?" Richard smiled gently. "You don't have to worry about that. I've already spoken to the director. Your place in the auditions is confirmed, and all expenses are covered." Tears filled her eyes. "Mr. Caldwell, I can't accept this," she said, shaking her head. "You can," he said firmly, but kindly. "Consider it a thank you from a father who got his son back." Lena pressed her hand over her mouth, trying not to cry. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Say you'll play, he replied softly. That's all I want. A few weeks later, Alina stood on the stage of the National Orchestra Hall for her audition. The lights were bright, and the judges sat silently, watching. She held the same violin Richard had given her, the one that once belonged to Isabella. She took a deep breath and began to play the Silent Heart. The hall was filled with her music. It was gentle and powerful at the same time. It carried every emotion she had lived, the struggles, the loneliness, the kindness that had changed her life. When the final note faded, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then one of the judges spoke softly, "Beautiful." When she left the hall, her hands were shaking. She didn't know if she had passed, but she didn't care. Playing that song in that place already felt like a victory. Days later, a letter arrived at her apartment. Her heart pounded as she opened it. She had been accepted into the National Orchestra. Her dream, once impossible, had come true. That evening, she went to the Caldwell mansion to share the news. Eli greeted her with his usual excitement, running up to her with his small violin. "Play, Alina," he said cheerfully. Hearing him say her name still made her eyes sting with happy tears. Richard came into the room, smiling. "You look like you have something to tell us." She nodded, hardly able to speak. "I got in," she whispered. "The orchestra, they accepted me." Eli clapped his hands and laughed, jumping around. Richard walked closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I knew they would," he said softly. "I'm proud of you." After she told him everything, Richard said there was something else he wanted to show her. He led her into a room she had never entered before. Inside, there was a new piano shining under the lights, and a framed photograph of Isabella on the wall. Beneath it hung a small golden plaque that read the Isabella Caldwell Music Fund. Alina stared at it in surprise. "What is this?" Richard smiled gently. "It's a scholarship for young musicians who can't afford instruments or lessons. You inspired it. Your story reminded me, and Eli, that talent can come from anywhere, and sometimes all someone needs is a little help." Her eyes filled with tears again. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "She would be proud." He nodded. "She would have loved you," he said. The next week, Alina began her new journey with the orchestra. But even with her busy schedule, she never forgot where her story began. Every Sunday morning, she still went back to the same street corner where she used to play. She set her violin case on the ground and played her favorite tunes for the people passing by. Sometimes, Eli joined her, standing beside her with his little violin, playing along shyly. People would stop, smile, and drop coins into the case, not realizing they were watching a world-class musician and the son of a billionaire. To them, they were just two people sharing a beautiful moment through music. Richard often stood at a distance, wearing his dark coat, watching quietly. He didn't interrupt, didn't draw attention. He just watched his son laughing and playing under the open sky. Every time, he felt peace. One chilly afternoon, as Alina finished the Silent Heart, the last notes drifted across the park, echoing softly. She looked up and saw Richard and Eli standing together. Eli waved, and Richard gave a small nod, smiling. In that moment, she realized how much had changed. The man who once seemed cold and untouchable now looked gentle, full of gratitude. The boy who once lived in silence now laughed freely. And she, the girl who once played for spare change, had found her purpose. Music had brought them together. It had healed wounds, built bridges, and changed lives as the sun began to set. Alina tucked her violin under her arm and looked out over the park. The world felt warm and full of light. Eli ran up beside her, his cheeks pink from the cold. "Play again?" he asked hopefully. She smiled and nodded. "Always," she said. And as her bow touched the strings once more, the sound floated through the air soft, full of love and hope. The same song that once awakened a silent heart now carried joy to everyone who listened. Richard stood watching, hands in his pockets, the faintest smile on his face. He no longer saw a street violinist. He saw the woman who had brought music back into his home, laughter back into his son's life, and peace back into his own heart. The final notes lingered in the golden evening light. wrapping around the three of them like a promise that kindness, no matter where it begins, can change everything.